Here you go.
All right, let's get things going. Maybe after or during our session here, the sun will come out. But we gotta light more candles, uh, so to speak. Okay, hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to PPOM's 2024 seminar series. And today is all about mental health and us, for you and your family. There's no secret that mental health has risen to the top among medical, physical, emotional, and other important part of our overall healthcare. That trauma, I think, has been significant, has become a major part of our lives and also affecting our families, and all caused by what we are experiencing today. Divisiveness, all this other stuff that's ongoing, notwithstanding the political side. So we're delighted to have Miss Mary Ellen Austria Lausman. Did I say that correctly, Mary Ellen Lausman? And Miss Jessica Higa join us this afternoon to help define how mental health governs our daily lives. I mean, do you have like a secret sauce that we could buy somewhere, or you know, a prayer to do that, and then a magic wand that can help us alleviate our mental health trauma? So let me turn it over to Lieutenant Colonel Retired Olivia Nunn, our Vice President for Communications at PPON, to introduce our program and also introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, sir. So today, we're going to dig right deep into the conversation of mental health. As many of you guys may or may not know, I am a huge mental health advocate. It is a personal story for me. As I retired 2.5 years ago, I hit rock bottom and nearly almost took my life, which is the irony. And considering that I was supposed to know how to transition well, supposed to have all the answers, and yet I hit rock bottom. So something near and dear to my heart. And also this conversation, I think, is aptly so, as we do it during AANHPI month. And it's a conversation that we need to have as leaders in the military. And oh, by the way, we don't like having this conversation within our community, an Asian community. It's shunned, it's shoved into dark corners, and we need to bring it to light. Like I say, shine a light, break the silence, end the stigma, and rewrite the narrative on mental health. And we can do that when we have this conversation. So thank you so much to our guest speakers as we do that today. And who are our guest speakers? We've got two of them. And today we've got Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Higa. She's an Army leader, a psychologist, a neuropsychologist with extensive experience in leading diverse teams across various roles within her job titles and duties. Her career has been defined by a commitment to dispel stigma and improve the mental health access with ease based on her wealth of experience and expertise in mind-body connections. She has dedicated herself to better understand the connection of complex issues involving TBI, PTSD, chronic pain, mood, and sleep issues. Colonel Higa is currently stationed in Okinawa, Japan. Thank you for joining us from the other side of the world. She is a behavioral health officer for the 38th Air Defense Artillery Brigade. She completed her doctorate in clinical psychology from the American School of Professional Psychology at Argosy University in Honolulu, Hawaii, as well as completing a fellowship in neuropsychology at Brooke Army Medical Center. She is deployed to Afghanistan in 2012 and to Liberia in 2014. Thank you so very much for joining us this afternoon. Super excited that you are here with us. And our other guest, Mary Ellen, a diversity and inclusion specialist for the Pennsylvania National Guard, serving the Army and Air. She began her career at the Department of Defense in January 2023. She has been in DEIA as a volunteer since April of 2012. Mary Ellen is a two-time VA Secretary's Diversity and Inclusion Excellence Award winner for the team category in 2014 and the supervisor manager category in 2017. She has a very successful career as a healthcare administrator and administrative officer for the VA in Florida and Georgia for almost 20 years. And she is proud to serve and lead her teams of healthcare heroes during the global pandemic. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in molecular and cellular neuroscience and a Master of Health Administration degree in 2000 and 2003. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, we've got some specialists, pros and they know what they're talking about. So ladies, thank you so very much. So let's just dig right into it. Considering what you guys have in a background, and I'm so excited that you guys are here today. And I'm going to start with you, Mary Ellen. What do you think is some cultural barriers that you see that surround mental health within our AANHPI community, and then specifically within the military community that you have seen from your lens where you sit?
I think mental health and even just the statement of it is something that we have been groomed and trained to deny. And in some ways, when we look at specifically the concept of AANHPI and individuals with targeted disabilities, we still have a lot of work to do in general with how we help the sickest of our populations. So when we cross that over to mental health, we have to almost unmask it and start to really admit that using the, concept of DEI and being the population that is seen as exceptional, that there is a fundamental cost in some ways to that component of being exceptional, and then just saying, what do we need to do that we can be ourselves as we work hard, for example. I think under the lens of the military, really starting to unmask the role of the military leader and what that is supposed to be or perceived to be by society, and then kind of reworking from a cultural lens how we look at the AANHPI military leader and what that can become when we think about future generations.
I'm going to turn that question to you, Lieutenant Colonel Haga, from your perspective as someone who has, come through the military, right? Because you don't get to Lieutenant Colonel overnight. So from your perspective, what have you seen, especially since this is something that you've been studying and this is your cornerstone? What do you see?
I think you nailed it when you spoke about your own experience of like each individual's how they grow up and how mental health, mental illness is perceived. I think in many ways, though, in Asian Pacific Island homes, mental illness exists, and I think that individuals know this. It's a family matter, and so mental illness is there, drug addiction is there, difficulties, hardships, all of that is experienced. But the stigma or the upbringing is very much that we don't need to seek outside help unless it gets so bad or it gets so out of control. And I think that that's the piece that the newer generation is actually changing. That's what I'm seeing, is it's this younger generation that's way more willing to come in and to ask for help, especially like in the service. I'm still in the Army, so I'm not back home, so I really don't know what my home looks like. But I do know that the doors and stigma for the younger generation, to me, has blown wide open. In fact, the one thing that I've noticed is that the younger generation is so willing to come in and speak that they utilize a lot more services. It's the more seasoned leaders that still have a difficult time of asking for help or reaching out to a colleague.
I'm glad that you said that. We had a conversation last season about the differences in culture when it comes to generation, right? The baby boomers, the Gen X's, the millennials, and the Zs, and how obviously that it has an impact on how we see mental health. But it's changing, just like you said, but we are still seeing how those that are in leadership and their view on mental health is impacting those that are beneath them, right? And I'm careful when I say beneath them, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I'm saying that from a formation perspective, right? Who they are entrusted to care and lead. But as a senior leader, when you don't take care of yourself in that aspect, because we say lead by example, it makes, the subordinates wonder, am I supposed to be taking care of my mental health? Is this the wrong thing to do if I choose to speak up? And so how, from your perspective, because you're in, how do we get after those senior leaders to say, hey, take a knee. It's okay. Address your mental health and be open and vulnerable with it so that your subordinates understand that it's okay for them to take that time out.
Yeah, that's the golden question right there, is how. I think that the best way is exactly what you're doing, is having this conversation, and as in many forms as we possibly can. Of course, just at work, being able to reach out and, walkabouts, and just really having these heart-to-heart conversations with our, colleagues as leaders. I learned from my first duty station as a psychologist up at Fort Drum, and my senior psychologist he always blocked out time to go walk around and have these closed door conversations with the leaders at Fort Drum. And I was so surprised because we were sort of always targeting the junior enlisted or the NCOs, and he was like, if the leaders aren't well, then they're not going to make great decisions. And if the leaders aren't sleeping, or they're stressed out, and they're going to be. And then there's another factor that we have to look at with leaders, is leaders are, obviously older, and that means that they have often older children or teenagers. There's more stressors that are involved. It gets complicated at the top, and it also gets very lonely. And so I think that just as you're doing, is reaching out in many forms as we possibly can, just to normalize that it's complicated and it gets tough. But that's the best way that I've seen it, and go about doing that.
For you, Mary Ellen, for somebody who's been in as a healthcare administrator, someone who's been in and around the VA, someone who's, deep in the work of DEI, how do you see strategies in being effective in overcoming the stigma, right? To be able to change this conversation for leaders about mental health, especially for our AANHPI community.
I think the most important thing when looking at it specifically from a DEI lens and also from an organizational development lens is we have to be honest about how we approach the pipeline of leadership. So one of the things in the work that I've tried to get at this year is understanding the number of supports that when you put an AANHPI in leadership, how many supports will that person need on entry, like early careerist versus mid versus senior, because our population holistically is only between 5 to 10% when we look at specific organizations, which means we don't have as much representation overall as far as peer groups and networking. What is that number? Right now, the only number that I know for certain because of my work at the VA is that people with targeted disabilities in leadership need 50. I'm positing now that the amount of supports through the pipeline of leadership is 25. So what that means is not just having 1 or even 5 peers to help you, but throughout your career, always asking for help and also specific strategic leadership help so that as you grow, you can be there and be able to address the challenges as they come. And for example, I was in leadership when I was 24 at the VA, but at the time there were 3 other AANHPI women who led when I did. So it really makes a difference. And kind of looking at that now through the military lens and what kind of pipelines can we build to address this proactively.
So when you're building those, right, obviously, there's a lot of stress, right? How were you able to, within your role, be able to provide the resources based on where you're at and being able to help them manage that stress and point them to those resources? And what are those resources?
So the way that you do this, and honestly, in my experience as a healthcare administrator, I focused mostly on inclusion and access. Shifting to the DoD and DEI, I'm really understanding diversity and equity. Because social equity and DEIA for the private sector is pretty much the holy grail. We work for it, but we never fully achieve it. But I saw it within my organization by week 2. What you do is you tell people that it's okay. It's okay if you don't know everything. It's okay for you to ask for not just ANHP or PI support, maybe through different resources or even community resources. The term I use is community leadership, but you also look for allies as you go, and to really build within your leadership structure, because we always did self-care and specifically meditation, to take a breath as you lead, that you can always pause. You don't have to rush, you don't have to push, but to give yourself a fundamental modicum of grace so you don't get overwhelmed, because the amount of people in our population that have led, for example, 500 people, it's going to take time for that. I've seen in my experience that for ANHPI, leadership structures have been closer to maybe 20 to 40 people. They're very different business models. So it's just going to take time, but grace will get you there, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Colonel Haga, for you, why is it, we talked about the differences in terms of, the old guys in the military and the young guys, right? And how they view mental health and the willingness to A, talk about it, and B, to get help. But in this conversation, because we've kind of got a breadth of people here in this conversation of mental health, why is it so hard, A, in our community within the military, and then B, within the Asian community? Why is it that we don't even want to talk about mental health?
I think that that's a great question. I think that the structure, I think, when you look at, and it sort of depends also of like, I mean, this is a huge span of, Asian Americans across Asia, and you got to look at generations of, if you're first generation or second generation, third generation, etc. If you're from, Hawaii or Pacific Islands, I think everybody has, some differences, and perhaps the area that's similar is that families is number one. And so the individual in that family unit, like, you can't break down to focus only on yourself when you're trying to support your family unit. And it's very difficult with this collectivism versus individualism, and, looking at Western style is more individualistic, and Asian Pacific Island is about family. And so sometimes we're not aware, or we're not brought up to become aware of, yourself and what you're experiencing. A lot of times it's, yeah, you can feel that way, but like, hurry up, like get over it, almost like keep going. We got other things to do. We got to complete things, or complete tasks, or push. And so I think that it just depends on the acculturation as well. But the main thing, historically has been families are trying to make it. And, especially nowadays too, if you look at Hawaii and just in California, and other areas, you know, it's very expensive to live. And so even individuals that are in the military, a lot of soldiers are sending money back home to try to support their families still yet. And so it's difficult to tap in to really see, like, where am I at? How am I feeling? Because I got to keep pushing, and I'm, you know, driving that inner drive. So again,
Glad you
it's
said that.
complicated.
I am so glad that you said that, right? That whole individual versus the family unit. And I think that is so true in the military, right? It is the collective, right? If you take a knee, your unit's going to suffer, right? That team is going to suffer. If not me, then who, right? But so much so when you said that, that resonated so deeply with me as, you know, because like I said, I crashed and burned, and I will give it that my family was there, right? They didn't turn from me, they didn't shun me, and they were there and helped me through my darkest, you know, deepest moments. But there came a point, right? They're like, okay, you're on a time. Okay, it's enough, right? They gave me just enough, but I hadn't recovered. But to them, they're like, this is good enough, right? Chop chop, go back to who you used to be, you know, that lieutenant colonel that, you know, got things done and didn't recognize that that girl is gone, right? That girl is gone and will never come back. And there is no timeline to healing, right? But it is exactly what you said. It was hurry up, fix yourself, put those pieces back, and just keep marching forward. When in fact that you can't do that, right? Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall and those pieces just don't come back together, right? With a visual perspective. In the military, based on what you do, what are the resources? Because this is what I find challenging as a mental health advocate, is the lack of resources. So from where you sit, what are the resources that we can point to our leaders and to our subordinates in this discussion?
I think active duty has the best resources available, because you're going to have, unless you're like far forward in these very small pockets, but for the majority of people that's on, you know, on a base with a military treatment facility, they're going to have a clinic that's dedicated to their unit. Whereas before it was sort of a one-stop shop. But nowadays, right, you will have a clinic and you will have an assigned provider that's taking care of your clinic, or that's taking care of the unit. So you're able to have that conversation. As a leader, you know your person, or if you don't know them, then you need to reach out to the clinic and find your person who is assigned to your unit. I think that the other thing that has happened, you know, over the last, I'm not even sure, 10, 15 years, is the MFLACs, the Military Family Life Consultants or counselors. And these folks are absolutely, you have embedded counselors, you have folks that are regional, folks that are transitional. And so it just depends on where you're stationed, but these individuals are also assigned to the unit, to the brigade, to the battalion even. And if you don't like them, you can still see the installation MFLAC. So I just think you have a lot of options. Now, MFLACs don't document. They do, you know, short-term solution-focused treatment. And then if you have like a diagnosed mental illness, or you have a diagnosis, then technically they're not supposed to see the MFLACs. They're supposed to go to their clinic. And then, you know, Military OneSource, that is an amazing, you know, opportunity for individuals to just, you can text, you can call, and then you can get, you can request for non-medical counseling, and they will give you somewhere between 10 to 12 sessions per issue. So it's not just like, oh, 10 and I'm done. It's like 10 because I'm having communication problems, and 10 because, you know, I'm have anger problems, and 10 because, you know, and the list can keep going on and on. So I think that the active duty has a lot more. For the National Guard and the Army Reserve, I think that there's less resources available unless they're on active duty, you know, for their 2 weeks, etc. And
So
I can't speak about the VA. I don't really know.
So I'll actually turn that over to Mary Ellen, since that's kind of your role there, especially working with the Pennsylvania National Guard and having a background in the VA. Where are those resources that you've seen and that you can point those that are listening in?
So the biggest thing is the social work arm of the VA specifically has a lot of embedded community resources, whether you can even Google them or find them on Facebook, social media resources. The other piece is, and this was just my experience in Florida, which was different than Pennsylvania. Um, the the populations that were fundamentally socioeconomically the most at risk were in the Buy Nothing group project. So individuals that needed more, that needed to restart, the number of actual clinical social workers in those groups was high. So it really depends on each state. Some of the things that we're trying to build as far as DEI practice in this area is taking all of the typical DoD and AIR maturity models and trying to find the business links for each of them. That was the core work I did this year in trying to create the framework. And the biggest thing that is very helpful, there is and I tried to find other resources this year, but there was a book that was published 12 to 14 years ago called Well-Being, the 5 Essential Elements. This particular book broke down the individual by career, finance, family, social, and physical. And another book that was published in 2022 was called Well-Being at Work. For these two books, this was through Gallup. The first book, 120 countries were reviewed. The second book, 160 countries were reviewed. And what they found was that when you have a life balance of 20% in each area, you're more likely to be mentally and physically well. The different populations within the Guard right now, I'm actually trying to figure out the percentage of focus based on the occupation. And then once that's figured out, the specific resources for each will be done. But the most important thing is to advise everyone here to think about how you look at your life in total, to kind of break down where your energy and your resources actually naturally go. And if in the 5, there's one area that you're really weak in, to figure out how to get supports for that. Because the weakest area for me, it's physical. If I don't manage the physical of the 5 essential elements, the other 4 will fall because there won't be enough resources. And that kind of model is what I'm trying to build within the Guard now. Because when we look at junior officers, I think people don't think about these things. And then when they get into a crisis, it typically is finance or family. So just looking into like where you sit, how secure you might be, how safe you might be, and then what support you might need in the specific areas. And then for the Pennsylvania National Guard specifically, a lot of the areas have resources through our family programs. And we're trying to build up that overall structure and also look at what we can do from a primary prevention standpoint.
I'm so glad that because you perfectly lined this up for my next question. But before we jump into this next question, if any of the people that are on this call have a question and would like to ask a question, just put your hand up and I'll pipe you in. With that being said, self-care practices, right? What do you guys recommend in terms of self-care practices? How do you manage that? How do you bring them into your routine? What should your routine be? And what would you do to encourage people in doing so to be able to manage mental health? I'll start with you, Mary Ellen, since you brought that up.
Okay. So with this, separate from being a healthcare administrator, I was a community leader in Florida. I was a civil rights activist, and I was raised to be chief of my generation. And I was picked to be chief when I was 3 years old. I was also diagnosed with epilepsy when I was 8. So taking that all together, I would say, talking about this as a peer, try to develop some type of meditative practice or even time where you step back simply from a situation that may be overwhelming. For my epilepsy condition, I actually meditate 3 times a day for 10 to 20 minutes, honestly, because of all the responsibilities I took over at a young age. And it helps to, even from a neurological perspective, it helps to methylate my brain. So I can, in some ways, emotionally and physically detox whatever stresses may be going on. And I personally as well hit my rock bottom in 2014 when I had uncontrolled epilepsy for 15 months. So I did cognitive behavioral therapy. I did those things and practices, and it really helped to be able to have me still stay employed, because in 2014, I was honestly a hair's breadth from being permanently medically disabled. So just stepping back long enough to have the will, and then to also just do the meditative practice to give yourself space in your silence with yourself and to cleanse yourself from whatever might be going on.
Valid points and very good ones. Thank you for sharing. I'll turn this over to you, Colonel Higa. For you, what do you see, especially not only as your role in the military, but also as an individual, you yourself? What would you say would be great self-care practices, and how would you implement them?
I think that it makes sense to be true to who you are just naturally. So for example, individuals that are, needs to be in the water, they got to surf, they got to dive, they got to get in a pool. Like, I think that it's important to tap into sort of who you are at your core. If you're a mountain person, if you're a water person, kind of finding those ways to help keep an individual active, especially nowadays. We have so many changes in, our ACFT, and how do you stay functional as you, age gracefully and having to, change things up. So I think that it's also important to look at ways to not just, before we used to just do the three amigos of push-ups, run, and sit-ups, and then we got really good at those, but then if I had to climb a wall, like, I was in trouble. So it's kind of functional pieces now of like just get out there, just move. And if you like to dance, then dance. If you like to climb in the mountains, then do that. I just think you have to, it's finding, not only staying physically active, but then that will help with the spiritual part, because you're doing something that's connecting you to you. And then finding ways to be creative, because that's also part of, like, when we look at wellness, we're very good at the analytical problem solving, MDMP, go get it all on this left side, but it's to counter that and to be creative and to, do something that's truly speaks to you, as opposed to, I'm going to drag 10 people to my Zumba class. That's not everyone's cup of tea. So finding that is most important. So you're not just like only working your body out. You're working all of it, mind, body, spirit, everything all at once.
No, I like that. So I'm going to shift a little bit in this conversation. We say this often, and you are not the only one that serves. And there's a backbone component to this, and that's your family, right? So your family's impacted by your mental health, whether that's your spouse, your partner, and even your kids. And so
Mhm.
from your seats, ladies, what have you seen in your role, and how in terms of how is mental health when it impacts the service member, how have you seen mental health impact the family, the partner, the spouse, and even the children? And I'll start with you, Colonel Higa. How have you seen the negative impacts of mental health when it's not addressed?
Oh, well, I mean, we see it all the time. We see relationship issues are, a problem. Family dynamics is an issue. Children, adolescents suffering. At least now, sort of the op tempo has died down a bit, so we're not seeing, mom or dad, on again, off again of the deployment cycles. But we definitely see the impact of all of the time away from the children, or the disconnect, or who the family members are, sort of, you're right, the backbone and the support system, for the service member. um and yet they, to me, are the most valuable and precious, gift. And you're absolutely right, like, I don't I can't do my job and get to where I am without their support. And having support for them is definitely a bigger challenge. It's a bigger issue. The other thing, though, it's not only military. I think across our society is the youth are having more and more anxiety and depression and stress, and they're having their own challenges. So I don't think that it's an isolated issue, but I definitely can see that they are like our mirror, and so it's important to tap in to understand, like, how are we doing as a family unit, and if there's an issue, it's important to look at ourselves, and how, we're functioning as a unit, but also individuals.
And for you, Mary Ellen, how have you seen the impact when it comes to the family side of the house when the service member doesn't address their mental health?
So I'll speak to my experience at the VA and what I saw more amongst the X generation and the boomer generation. The hardest piece is, in those situations, those service members were the community leaders. It's not even that they don't want to address it, but the constant grind of the responsibility in different arenas, I saw that they were more likely to fall before they, kneeled. And what was difficult was letting go of the chief role was socially debilitating, because that was their core identity. And when looking at DEI specifically, when you touch someone's core identity, it is always going to be directly linked to some type of mental health issue, because the same thing with the transition from the military to the civilian, it is part of who they are. And you have to have almost a fundamental understanding to help them learn to let go of the community leadership role so that they can take care of themselves. And honestly, as a peer in this example, even though I only had a few relatives in my family who were in the military, trying to get my own father to let go when he led the family as second in command for 50 years is still something that we're working through. So it's very deep, but it's a fundamental thing that we have to address as a population.
You saying that totally, totally connected with me, right? It is so true, right? I saw it in my grandmother, saw it in my mother. You know, it impacted the way I see the world in the lens. Like it is a military perspective, and it is me being a Korean American, right? It is why I had such a hard time in my transition. It is part of the reason why I hit rock bottom. It is that identity, right? I am the oldest of three. I was told that the family responsibility is yours. And so when you said that, not being able to let go and just keep on grinding, right? Like yeah, it totally resonated with me, and just how I didn't know how to, as we say in the army, put that rucksack down. Um, and that impacted my kids 100%. We've got a comment. Sir, I'll turn it over.
Olivia, thanks. So, a question. So we tend to talk about mental health challenges, sort of dealing with the here and now. I'm interested in the downstream impact for hundreds of thousands of soldiers and service members who served in combat over a long conflict. So, you know, when they were dealing with trauma in situations, they were sort of at their best, most physically fit, youngest, most able to deal with a lot of these situations. What's going to happen 10, 15, 20, 30 years later? Does time heal all wounds, or will they start to have mental health challenges from these experiences as they get older?
Colonel Higa, I know I've had conversations with
Yeah.
other experts, and I've got my opinions, but Colonel Higa, I think this is kind of your lane, so I'll turn it over to you first.
I am, I'm going to preface this just to say that I'm an optimist. I don't think that all trauma means that it's going to, like, trauma does not equate that there's going to be a disorder. There are lots of individuals that can go through traumatic experiences and have traumatic growth. It doesn't always mean that, an individual, if I've had, 2 deployments or 15 deployments, that is going to equate that I'm going to, have a mental break. I think that a lot of it has to do with sort of predisposition. It has to do with self-care. However, I think that individuals that go through a lot of trauma, and if you're not dealing with the trauma, if you're just shoving it in that rucksack and carrying it, eventually it gets heavy. And eventually, I liked what Mary Ellen said, though, is that, rather than taking a knee, things will just come tumbling down. Sometimes individuals will begin to do other things that are, very detrimental to their mental health, like drinking. Alcohol is a depressant. So if I have trauma and I'm consuming a depressant over time, that's not good, So it's sort of like, it just depends on the individual. I don't think that we're going to have, this mass generation of problems, as long as we deal with it. And by like these forums to talk about it, get a therapist if you need one, meditate, take a yoga class, talk about it. I think that there's so many different forums nowadays that really help individuals. And I've seen a lot of social media as a platform for individuals to be able to express and communicate what they went through. And those things can be very, very healing. So I think that just because there's a trauma doesn't equate to a problem. It's if you don't deal with it, then it can become a problem.
What I will say, sir, what I have found out is the following, is that we have not done our due diligence, and I say we, the military, in terms of the medical screening that's necessary to effectively look at us from a medical standpoint during our service and as we are leaving service, to then give us the adequate healthcare that is necessary to begin the treatment, right? Whether or not it's because it's based on trauma or that we're going to need it. Then the issue becomes when they become in crisis, because none of that was done, now we are in reactive mode. Let me paint the picture. When I started going down this work, one of the things I recognize is that majority of us have not even had our brain scan, right? A huge part of mental health is the gray matter here, but yet most of us have not even had our brain scanned. Well, let's peel this onion back about the scanning of the brain, an MRI. Well, majority of the machines in most hospitals, the machine that scans it, the specific type of machine, the resonance of it, right? The equipment, the level of that machine is a level 1. So what that means from a technical perspective is it does not have the capability to give you a clear picture of the brain. And the part of the brain, in order to really see it, is this part of the brain. And because they have a level 1 machine, it's not giving a clear picture of the brain right here. It kind of is like fuzzy. It's kind of like, you know, so how do you effectively study the brain, be able to study that individual if the picture that you're getting is fuzzy right here? So you really need a level 3 or a level 5. And I just said the majority of the hospitals across the US, to include the ones on the military installations, have a level 1. Guess where all the other ones are? At other various hospitals. And when I found that out, it actually ticked me off, and I started crying, like hard crying. That why is it that us, the ones that served, couldn't even get a brain scan and get it scanned with the right piece of equipment, like a level 3 or a level 5, and it should be standard. So therein lies the first part. And then the second part is, how hard is it to see a specialist, and then a specialist who's willing to listen, who's willing to say, let's walk you through the problems, and then not throw medicine at you. Like, how many times when I do talk to someone, they're like, oh, let's just give you a bunch of pills. I don't want to take a bunch of pills, right? There's so many layers to that. So to answer your question, sir, how do we get effectively in front of that problem, so when it's downstream, we're not going to a bunch of funerals, right? We're effectively fixing this problem. And I truly believe it's a lot of it's policy. We have to throw some money at this to fix it. But we have to address this. And a huge part of it is we have to have this conversation. We have to stop sticking it into the dark corners, that there is a problem. We've got to address it, and we've got to fix it.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to add something to this conversation. When looking at socioeconomic class specifically as an intersectional piece of data, and looking at what the soldier has to do when they're transitioning, someone who might have an entrepreneurial spirit and be what I would define as generation 1, they will be able to transition no matter what the trauma is and pick up. You go to, and there are 5 generations when looking at socioeconomic status. You look at someone who might have the biological, physical, behavioral markers of generation 4 or 5. If they are already coming from a history of less than, of not as much privilege, not as much availability or opportunity, they go into war, they're more at risk. You're just adding to what they already had. That stuff is going to be very clear once they come out. You will know, based on the math and the socioeconomic class, only a smaller percentage as you go through the generations will be able to pick up. Others will need resources. And then the hardest thing when looking at socioeconomic class, someone who's generation 1, who's self-made, will not socially be able to relate economically to a generation 4. A generation 1 is not going to help a generation 4. They're not going to know how. A generation 3 will be able to help a generation 4, but multiple generation 3s, the community resources, will be able to help that 4. And so that's why this is so complicated, because it's not simple. It requires severe scalable resources, and it has to be something that is strategically planned. to get at this issue from a global standpoint.
I'm so glad that you said that. You're absolutely right. So as we shift and we talked about a lot of, where we are, but how do we get to that future vision? And you said a lot about community support, which I'm glad that you did, but how do we get to that future vision? Like, what specifically do you think is needed from a community, cultural, government perspective to be successful? And I'll start with you, Mary Ellen.
So when looking at DEIA as a lens specifically, one of the things that I learned this year, and I had been in the practice for 11 years before coming to the Guard, is that within the military structure, diversity and equity are linked. Those concepts are linked as far as resource allocation, inclusion and accessibility are linked. So my healthcare career at the VA was an inclusion accessibility model. My Pennsylvania career feels like a diversity equity model. It's the scenario I always give of this single bottle of water. We're either doing access or we're doing equity. We give this to one person or multiple people drink it. So we're going to have to figure out from a very strategic, big picture, what units are going to need equity and what units are going to need access. And how do we break that down when we look at the numbers that we're working with in each of the command structures, and then decide how that's going to be implemented as far as resource allocation. Because access, I'm still trying to address that in this diversity equity model. It is a hard thing, but it's something that we're still trying to poke or get through to try to find access per unit.
Colonel Higa, I'll turn that to you. Where do you think for the future vision for us to be successful, to be able to provide mental health support and really at the end of the day, it's about readiness for our military, right? When we are a ready fighting force, then we're a winning force. So from your lens and what you do, what do you see?
I think that for the future, it's really about recruiting and retention of mental health support. I know that it's very, very difficult to recruit. I know that it's difficult to retain. The VA is paying more for the same job than the active duty side, than DHA. So it's things like that. And on the other side, I think it's about helping young people look at this line of work as a profession, and being able to train more professionals, because sure, down the line we're going to need more, and you can't take one provider who's going to provide for everyone, right? It's really difficult, the amount of care that each provider is providing for their unit, or you can only have so many people on your panel. And so that, I feel like, being short-staffed, etc., needs to be addressed in the future for sure. I also think that, like I said in the very beginning, I think that young people are getting at it faster. And so, again, I'm an optimist, thinking that they have wonderful tools that's, even being addressed at basic training. So hopefully, these skills that they're learning will be helpful in the future as well. So I think looking at it from a prevention side, as well as having this support when needed.
What I will do is turn it over to anybody that's in the audience if they have any last minute questions to our two amazing panelists that have provided such great insight on this much needed conversation. If anyone has any questions that they'd love to have answered. Go ahead.
Okay. James Uri here, calling from Hawaii. It's early for me, but Okinawa it's really early. Anyway, thanks for being on, and first off, terrific job, Olivia, facilitating this discussion, and for Jessica and Mary Ellen. I mean, I've been through quite a bit of training lessons and things on this topic, but this is probably the most well put together hour, very impactful, and talking about the things I think we need to talk about. One question I do have has to do with assessment tools and methods. So, you know, to the very good question about where are we going to be down the line? Well, how do we know before the trains actually run into each other that we have a problem, or somebody, you know, collapses? That you know, that there are issues developing. So it seems to me, you know, we do some dipsticking in areas like just the physical fitness, but on mental fitness, how do not just the clinicians, but how do leaders, and in line with this this theme, you know, how do you self-assess where you are and maybe where you're headed? But thank you.
Colonel Higa.
I think consultation is the key. Again, finding professionals. I mean, whether it's civilian or, you know, military, consulting with a provider, a professional, being able to look at performance improvement plans. I'm always amazed at, you know, fresh eyes, young blood comes in, and they have wonderful ideas. And so it's about, you know, taking a look and having these performance improvement processes, you know, a Lean Six Sigma, you know, being able to see, is this going to be effective? How does this impact? I do think that, you know, with the military structure in medicine, you know, things have become very organized and similar across the board. Whereas maybe 20 years ago, you know, you'd be in one place and you'd have somebody doing equine therapy, you know, or a cat cafe, you know, or this or that, or however. But I think now they're really looking at standardized medicine. But that doesn't mean that, you know, individuals can't get that. They can do that on the outside, for example. But I think that it's really about finding ways, you know, to see, is there a problem? What might be the problem? Sensing sessions, focus groups. I mean, these are I'm sure 100 years ago, they were still doing the same thing of just walking and talking to the soldiers and really getting to know the soldiers, their families, those kinds of things. What's the problem? What do we need to do to improve it? And I always ask them, not just like what the issue is, but if you could change it, what would you, you know, recommend? And then often we make that into a little performance improvement, you know, plan to see if that actually works or not. But I agree that sometimes, you know, we don't know what we don't know. And that's the difficult part, is trying to predict the future.
I totally agree with you, Colonel Higa. There's something that was lost. You know, I think back what you said back in the day when I was a young lieutenant, right? It was that I was told, get to know your soldiers, right? Spend that time. You should know everything about, you know, the soldier and their family, and do those wellness checks. And somewhere along the line, we lost that art. But also I say this, right? We say do those buddy checks. It's so simple, but I think in the art of how we've gotten so busy in our day-to-day lives and how social media has taken over, and that we feel like because we see them on social media, that's the same as checking in, which I say, this is my line of business. I'm a PR agent, right? I do social media for a living, but that's not always true. Social media is a glimpse in someone's life, a snapshot in time. And that is not necessarily a true reflection of someone's life. And smiles hide a lot of pain. I say that a lot. And the strongest one of us is often the one that hurts the most. So, true to
Mm.
what you said, take the time out, call them, pick up the phone, go over to them, and just simply say, how are you doing? And cut the BS. And let's be honest, let's grab a cup of coffee. And I think it's, going back to the roots of what we learned as true leaders. I think that's really how you're going to be effective in getting, before the bang and really finding out and helping them. And then getting to the resources that we talked about earlier. What about you, Mary Ellen? What do you think?
So this is always just the universal, and I will work with my practice as time goes. The biggest thing is determining what your timeline is for compassion fatigue. So as a leader, we all go through it. Is it 2 months? Is it 3 months? In the most severe circumstances for me, it was actually up to 7 months. And then also thinking about how often when you lead are you reassessing and stepping back and saying, what is your stress response to certain situations, and figuring out what the kind of nuancing of a situation type is, so that you can prepare yourself and ask for the buddy checks and get the check-ins. Because I think in leadership, we don't ever say it's going to hurt, but in leadership, it will at some point, and we have to build the machine before it comes so we don't fall.
Thank you. Hopefully that answered your question, sir.
Yeah, those were excellent responses. And for our two panelists, especially, one of the questions I tried to ask those in my organization who are kind of one-ofs is who's helping the helper. And we in units, smaller units, you have one chaplain, and a lot of times the unit itself and the unit leadership is not necessarily equipped to help a chaplain be a better chaplain, but also be a better officer, be a better leader. And so that's a question that I would leave with everybody to think about that. And one of the helpers, as you mentioned, are leaders. And leaders are the ones that, okay, well, who is their buddy that's going to be checking up on them? So anyway, something to think about. But again, excellent discussion, very informative. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We'll take one more question before we turn this over.
Let me make a comment. I find this really, outstanding that we're having this discussion. And sadly, we didn't have enough folks, logging in. Growing up in the military force, like all of us, that when we take a physical exam, there's no exam for the mental acuity. It's all about how are you feeling, take a blood test, all the necessary that says, okay, you're good to go back out there. And what the stories here and all the comments are made that if we ever get to the point where the physical exam includes your mental health, your mental fitness, will be great instead of making that a specialized appointment in the medical system. Fort Riley, I read it in the Army magazine, had started a program for mental fitness. And it's a timeout kind of a session. It's on their Mission Essential task list for their training. It's not as much as training, but taking a timeout and do activities, all kinds of activities, and to talk about like a seminar of this question, of this degree, and talking to the division psychology clinic for that matter, because they lead this process. But it's also partnered with experts, external experts, and also other on the community. It's a community. It's not just a chaplain, but also the medical side of the house. And I'm not so sure that the Army has taken that. Maybe they have, and they're just doing a pilot test. Because it does take a lot of time when you do something like that. It kind of takes away from the normal mission essential task list that's getting your tanks maintained or going to the National Training Center and things like that, which is far more important. But I would suggest that if the Army and the rest of the armed forces is serious about mental health, they ought to do that. By the way, I did take a brain MRI, like and this happened like last year as a precursor for a surgery that I had at that time. And I waited, and of course, my surgeon said that, I jokingly said, well, the test says that you're borderline AB normal and normal. We just kind of laughed about that. I said, seriously, because I'm totally afraid about memory loss, which is part of the whole issue for mental health, right? But one thing that I think we are afraid of sometimes is doing a self-examination per se, kind of getting to know who you really are, because you don't want to have the result stigmatize you. Because this is all about the family matter, right? Once the doctor says, oh, you're having all these issues, your mental health, and you're not mentally fit, what does it take? You're losing the grip of your life. And sharing that without losing your pride is as more as important as just saying, I have an issue here, I have a problem. And I think we should be a bit more transparent about that, but it's going to take time. There's the old adage about older people, right? There's 3 of us here that not General Quintas, because he's much younger than us, but James and I, General and I are elderly people, and we've gone through the trauma of being in uniform, as well as everybody else here, because war existed. But I think there's going to be a part 2 of this session. 1 hour and a half is not going to deal with that, and broadening this whole issue that, like Mary is an expert on this, and Jessica, Lieutenant Colonel Higa, is an expert on this, but let's bring in the other people that really knows all about dealing. We did this as a resilient, like Lee, Jim, the resilient programs when people came back from the war, and we partnered it with the family members, and then he went on. But it also disappeared after that, right? Because they probably ran out of money. But it should be a continuity over the lifetime for people that needs it, because there's one factor in our family is talking about the kids and how it affects on the kids. So yeah, we'll schedule a part 2, I think. I think you all agree on that. If it's free,
Sir, you know me, I will always talk about mental health. It is my platform.
there you go.
Can't twist my arm to do that.
But I share General Quintas and General Hirai's compliment. I think this is great. Again, it's about recognition.
Well,
Any other input out there?
Thank you so much.
I see a lot of hand. Catherine Todd from FAPAC. I think she wants to say something. Catherine, you want to log in?
Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Mary Ellen and Olivia, for taking the time, and Dr. Higa to have this conversation. But I agree with General Taguba that, if we have a second session or a third session, I will definitely, participate and try to bring more people, because the conversation is important.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our 2 amazing panelists, Mary Ellen, Colonel Higa. Thank you for your time, especially you, Colonel Higa, piping in from Okinawa. I know, your time zone is completely different from ours. Thank you again, ladies, for giving up your time, just coming on, giving us your, not only just of your expertise, but just your passion to this conversation. It is much needed. It is something that we do need to, like I say, break the silence, shine a light, end the stigma, and rewrite the narrative when it comes to military mental health and within our own community. Because when we do, we give breath and space to be able to change the light for tomorrow. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who piped in today, just being able to spend this time with you. I know you could do so many different things at 1 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, but the fact that you spent your time with us, I totally appreciate.
Thank you.
Please continue to do what you do and sharing the good message of PPOM. Tell your buddies to join our great organization to lead, mentor, and guide the next generation to serve our great Army, or whatever serves. But you know, I am biased. Go Army, be Navy.
Army first.
That's right.
Thank
So,
you again
thank
for
you so
joining us
much.
this afternoon, and have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Aloha, Jessica.
Thank you so much.
Aloha. Take care.